Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I want to talk to you about a question that gets raised quite a lot in the running community. What are the exercises that are truly functional for runners? And you do need those little quotation marks around it. Now, I want to talk about this because actually, through the years, a lot of good exercises have been kind of thrown away because they've been dismissed as not being truly functional. And I think this is a real shame because it means often our exercise options are getting less and we're dismissing things that can be really quite good for our patients potentially. And actually, it's not really a particularly evidence-based approach either. You'll often find it's more opinion-based, perhaps people simply picking on exercises that they don't like very much. So in this video, I want to explore what is it that the muscles need to do during running? What is their function? And how can we then design exercises which are able to achieve and enhance that function? And hopefully through this video, you'll see actually we can expand our exercise options quite a lot if we consider it in a slightly more reasoned, more evidence-based approach. Now, if you want to learn a lot more about running injury, if you want to expand your exercise options, do check out Running Repairs online. I've put a link to that in the title. It's open at the moment with a great bonus package if you enroll today. Okay, well, let's first of all think about what are muscles doing during running? What is their function? What are they really trying to achieve? Well, we think they actually have to behave a little bit like a complex spring. So when we land, they absorb energy and then they release it again like a spring to propel us forward. That is one of their main functions. Now, in doing that, they're exposed to some really high peak forces. Now, if we have a look at what those peak forces are, roughly, from some of the research papers, we see glute med, for example, is thought to manage about 4 times body weight in peak forces, which is a lot for that muscle to manage. The quads muscle group manages 4 to 6 times body weight in peak loads. And then the soleus is really the daddy on the list here, managing somewhere around 6 to 7 times body weight in peak load during running. And these figures would change with different running styles and also across different speeds, with some of these muscles working harder as we run faster. Particularly the hamstring, we know, will work harder when we're looking at higher speeds. So we know these muscles then, they need to function like a spring in storing and releasing energy. They need to manage high peak forces. They need to be able to produce these high peak forces very, very quickly. And they need to be stiff enough as a spring to achieve it. If you think about a loose floppy spring, you drop it on the ground and it kind of goes splat. It doesn't have that elasticity, that stiffness for efficient motion. So an exercise that is functional for a runner is one that helps the muscle behave like this spring, helps it produce enough force, helps it to produce that force quickly enough, and helps the muscle to be stiff enough to behave efficiently like a spring. Now, a crucial point here is the exercise does not need to look like running to achieve that. And I think that's one of the common criticism of exercises when they're described as non-functional. You look at something like the Running Man exercise. Now, this is okay as a balance or proprioception exercise. It does have some value there, I would say, but it's not exposing the body to high peak forces. It's not likely to develop strength. It's not really that great at preparing the muscle to function like a spring. So while it looks quite a lot like running, it's probably not that functional compared to other activities. It's not going to really develop the strength that we would need to cope with those high peak forces. So how might we develop that strength? Well, I think it's perfectly reasonable to do some isolated muscle work. Now, again, these tend to get dismissed because they don't look much like running. These isolated activities, things like seated knee extension in the gym or sideline leg lifts for working the glutes, but they can help to strengthen that muscle to help it to manage those high peak forces. There's also evidence with these being utilized in the treatment of things like tendinopathy. because those isolated exercises are highly likely to load the tendon, which we want to stimulate change. So I think there is value in isolated strength work to help us manage those high peak forces, especially where it's relevant to that individual's pathology or to your assessment findings. If you find they're particularly weak in the glutes or the quads, why not try and work those muscles in isolation to strengthen them? Now, there's been a phrase for quite a long time that you might hear around occasionally on social media: treat the movement, not the muscle. And that's pushing us more towards compound lifts, as squats, lunges, deadlifts, etc., because they're considered to be, again, more functional. But I would say, why not treat the movement and the muscle? Use the isolated exercises to strengthen that muscle where it's relevant to the individual, and use your compound movements to strengthen the muscle synergistically with other groups they're likely to work with. And again, it's more about thinking, what are the pros and cons here of each of these different exercise options? It's something we really encourage in our online course. Rather than dismissing something altogether, think of what are the pros and cons of it. Now, something like a compound movement, like say a squat, is a great exercise for targeting multiple muscles. But sometimes you can find a deficit in one muscle group can kind of be overlooked in these exercises. I've seen that on the leg press, for example. People who are quite weak in their quads, they're using glute max to help them to really get the movement on the leg press, and the quads kind of gets away with that weakness. It doesn't really get found out and addressed until we get them on something like a seated knee extension and really work it. So why not use some isolated muscle work in conjunction with some compound movements? And why not really get kind of the holy trinity, all three things involved, and work specifically on function too? Now, quite often people will say that, exercises need to be functional. They need to try and replicate the functional movement. Now, if you really reason that through to its endpoint, you might say, well, surely the function itself then is the best exercise. If we've got an injured runner, we just want to get them running. Now, this makes sense on the surface until you dig into the science a little bit. Now, running is a fantastic activity. I love running. I couldn't go without it. Most of my runners feel the same. But it's not that great at stimulating things like strength change. The activity isn't really ideal for that. It's also not that great at stimulating tissue adaptation. We might get some from the earliest parts of that running, maybe the first 5 to 10 minutes, but as we push beyond that, we're not likely to see much more adaptation. And that's again where our strengthening exercises can help to encourage more tissue adaptation to facilitate that return to running. And where just focusing on function alone is the issue, it's a vast majority of people that see us in clinic, they come to us with pain. It hurts for them to run. So just focusing on the running might not be enough to help get them back. Now, if you are working on function, if you want to build running gradually as part of your treatment, and I highly recommend you do, you can't really get someone back into their running and achieving their goals without a gradual return. I think it makes sense to try and make a program based on what someone can manage and build from there. Now, a lot of physios, a lot of therapists find this difficult. So we put together a great selection of different training programs in a bonus package that you'll get if you enroll in Running Repairs Online today. There's a really good program I use a lot with runners that are just coming back from long-term injury, and it works really well to ease them back into running before we build from there. So do check those out. Now, I wanted to think, whilst we're talking about function, again, to highlight the benefits of thinking more broadly, I want to think a little bit now about the hamstrings. So think about what the hamstrings need to do during running. If we have a look at some of the research, what we see, if you look at things like EMG studies, which tell us when these muscles are active and how active they are, what we can see here is that we see a peak in muscle activity in the medial and lateral hamstrings on the far right hand side of this graph, which coincides with the terminal swing phase of running. So what we think is happening there is, as a runner swinging their leg ready to plant the foot in contact with the ground, the hamstrings are actually working to slow that leg down, ready for foot contact in that last part of the swing phase. Because they're working to slow that leg down, it's highly likely we think that that's very much an eccentric hamstring contraction. So it's working to decelerate and slow the leg ready for foot contact. So if we want an exercise that's functional for the hamstrings, it's helpful for us to include one that has an eccentric bias to it. Now, if we think about someone who's, say, a sprinter, we know that they have very high peak hamstring loads because hamstring loads increases significantly as you push up towards sprinting. So a functional exercise for a sprinter would be one that exposes the body to high levels of eccentric load, which would be something like your Nordic curl. Now, again, these have been dismissed as not functional because they're in kneeling. Your running doesn't usually look like this unless you face planted halfway around your route. So these have been dismissed as not functional, but actually they expose the hamstring to a high level of eccentric contraction, which is exactly what it needs to cope with during running and particularly during sprinting, which is why this exercise can be useful in treating and addressing hamstring injuries in sprinters, in footballers, in people that are exposing their hamstrings to short bursts of fast running and sprinting. Now let's reason that back through again with what we've said before. If that runner's coming into us with this history of hamstring injury, why not do some isolated muscle work, some prone hamstring curl work perhaps, so we can load that hamstring up in a heavy way to stimulate increases in muscle strength, in bulk, and in adaptation within the muscle. Why not do some compound work as well if you want to? If you want to do something like a deadlift, by all means do that to bring in those other muscle groups as well. But you'd also want to include an eccentric bias through something like the Nordics, a really heavy eccentric bias if you can, to stimulate a lot of those positive changes in the hamstring to improve things like fascicle length and hopefully then facilitate that return to running and sprinting. But crucially, as we've said, if you want to use isolated work and compound work, work the function too, and you would want to include a graded return to sprinting alongside that. So we see that kind of holy trinity that I've mentioned in play again. Isolated work if it's indicated, compound work to support that, a graded return to function, and then you're going to get the best results for these people. Now, hopefully you can see through what we've discussed so far that when we think about function in a broader context and we don't restrict it down to an exercise just having to look a bit like the sport itself, it opens up loads of options for you. And I would really encourage you to look at it this way and think of other ways that exercises may achieve function for people that you're seeing in clinic, particularly those with injury. Now, as I mentioned at the start, we do have our online course available, Running Repairs Online, is available for you for enrollment at the moment. We've got a great bonus package if you enroll today. And in that online course, we have a whole module devoted to strength and conditioning with a great selection of exercise videos to give you lots of options for runners that you'll see in clinic and help you get great results. So do check that out. Click on the link, have a look at that great bonus package. I highly recommend checking that out. And thank you very much for listening again today. I'd like to hear from you. What do you think? Have you any exercises you think are actually really valuable, but that seem to get dismissed quite regularly? Perhaps you see things differently. Perhaps you think that what we're talking about isn't truly functional. Let us know in the comments and replies. Let us know if you've got any questions, and I'll look forward to reading those. Thanks again for listening. Bye for now.